Mary Graves had heard stories of frontier dangers, but nothing could prepare her for this moment. On a spring evening, as the Donner Party made its way west, a group of Sioux riders appeared, their attention fixed on Mary. They surrounded her, offering her brother extravagant trades to take her with them. When he refused, their persistence turned to action. One rider grabbed her horse's reins, pulling her away from the wagon train. As her brother locked eyes with the riders, it became clear this would not end without a fight. The story of the Donner Party is a well-known tragedy of starvation and survival. But there are parts of their journey, dark, harrowing, and deeply human, that are often overlooked. We'll explore some horrifying and humbling facts about the Donner Party and their trek through the brutal American frontier. Their journey began like many others, heading west. They gathered in Independence, Missouri, the last major outpost before entering the wild frontier. Their group, originally around 100 members, was one of more than 500 wagons trekking toward Oregon and California that year. Yet, to put it in perspective, only about 1,300 people were scattered along the vast expanse of the trail at any given time. In a nation of 23 million people, their presence was barely a whisper across the endless prairies. The prairies of the frontier were anything but safe. Contrary to many versions of the story, early on in their journey, tragedy did strike. William Trimble, a member traveling with the Graves family, was killed in a brutal assault by Pawnee natives. His wife and children, deeply traumatized and heartbroken, turned back to Independence, unable to face the trail ahead. Fear of Native American hostility was ever present on the trail, with tribes like the Sioux and Pawnee often displaying open hostility. Yet not all encounters with Native Americans were hostile. At Fort Laramie, the Donner Party encountered a large Sioux encampment. The Sioux were on the warpath against Snakes and Pawnees, but their interactions with the immigrants were remarkably peaceful. The Sioux, dressed in vibrant war paint and mounted on a fleet of ponies, were an awe-inspiring sight. 300 young warriors escorted the Donner Party's wagons in a disciplined, military-style formation. As the wagons passed, each warrior held a green twig or leaf in his mouth, a symbol of peace and goodwill. It was a moment of cultural exchange that left the pioneers in awe. But peace on the frontier was fragile. Not long after the Sioux escort, a group of young warriors attempted to raid the wagons. They surrounded a portion of the train, targeting the Graves family, and began stealing small items. W.C. Graves rode to the Sioux encampment to report the incident. The chief, seizing a shotgun, mounted his horse and charged towards the wagons with astonishing speed. His fierce war cry startled the raiders, who fled in panic. One raider was slow to escape, and the chief discharged his weapon, wounding the man's pony and grazing his leg. The chief's swift and decisive action ensured that his orders of peace would not be disobeyed again. Despite this, tensions between the cultures were ever present. Mary Graves, a young and strikingly beautiful woman in the party, experienced a chilling encounter. While riding on horseback with her brother, Mary caught the attention of a band of Sioux riders. Enamored with her, they made increasingly extravagant offers to purchase her. When her brother refused, one rider seized the reins of her horse, seemingly ready to take her by force. The moment may have been intended as a joke, but it was no laughing matter. Her brother leveled his rifle, and the Sioux promptly released the reins, diffusing the situation, but leaving a lasting impression of the ever-present dangers on the trail. And tensions weren't limited to outside threats. Within the Donner Party itself, every decision, whether to push ahead or rest, to hunt or conserve, became a source of conflict. Scarce resources created divisions between families and hired teamsters. These disagreements would lay the foundation for the party's ultimate unraveling. The most consequential and catastrophic decision of their journey came at Fort Bridger. It was here that the party learned of a supposed shortcut, the Hastings Cutoff. Lansford Hastings, a self-proclaimed frontiersman, had convinced immigrants that his route was quicker and easier. Encouraged by Jim Bridger and his partner Vasquez, who had supplies to sell, the Donner Party gambled on the unproven path. Hastings' route turned out to be a nightmare. Crossing the Wasatch Mountains, the party spent 3 grueling weeks hacking their way through dense brush and rocky terrain. Hastings himself had left only vague directions. As their progress slowed, food supplies dwindled and tensions escalated. And then came the Salt Lake Desert. The Donner Party, already exhausted and demoralized, faced one of their most harrowing challenges yet. Misled into believing the desert crossing was just 50 miles, they discovered the true distance was closer to 75. Parched and desperate, oxen collapsed from thirst, with some running madly into the wasteland, never to return. James Reed, one of the party's leaders, lost nearly all of his livestock, leaving his family and others further imperiled. By the time they emerged from the desert, their remaining provisions were dangerously low. Before leaving the desert camp, the emigrants took stock of their dire situation. An inventory of provisions revealed the grim truth. There was not enough food to sustain the party through California. As if to underscore the lateness of the season, a storm dusted the hilltops with snow during their final night at camp, a chilling reminder of what lay ahead. Faced with the prospect of starvation, the group held a solemn council and decided to send for help. 2 volunteers, William McCutcheon of Missouri and C.T. Stanton of Chicago, stepped forward. Each man took a horse, carrying letters from the Donner Party addressed to Captain Sutter at Sutter's Fort, a desperate plea for relief. McCutcheon, leaving his family behind, had every reason to return, but Stanton's motives were less personal. Young and unmarried, he had no obligations beyond his word and a sense of honor. As the 2 men rode westward, the weary eyes of the migrants followed them until they disappeared onto the horizon, leaving behind a faint hope in the wake of their departure. With their provisions dwindling and their spirits strained, the Donner Party pressed on into an uncertain future. Ahead lay the Sierra Nevada, looming as both a final barrier and an ominous harbinger of the suffering to come. The party's survival now rested in part on whether McCutcheon and Stanton would fulfill their promise and return in time with the salvation they so desperately needed. Some days went by, and at Gravelly Ford, a fight over leadership erupted in shocking violence. Tensions had been building throughout the journey, but it reached its breaking point here. John Snyder, a passionate and fiery man, became enraged when his team tangled with Reed's. Snyder, already frustrated, began beating his cattle mercilessly with the butt of his whipstock. When James Reed arrived on horseback after hunting, he tried to calm Snyder down and offered assistance. However, Snyder, fueled by his anger, lashed out verbally and rejected the offer. Words escalated quickly, with Reed suggesting they settled the dispute after they made it up the hill. Snyder misinterpreted this as a threat and retaliated with physical violence. Snyder struck Reed multiple times on the head with a heavy whipstock, opening deep gashes and blinding him with blood. Mrs. Reed, witnessing the danger, attempted to intervene, but her bravery placed her in harm's way. One of Snyder's strikes landed on her head and shoulders, and in that moment, fearing for his wife's safety, Reed acted on pure instinct. He drew his hunting knife and struck Snyder in the chest, piercing his lung. Snyder staggered back, speechless and mortally wounded, before collapsing. The tragedy left the party stunned and divided, and Reed was subsequently banished from the group, sent ahead on foot into the wilderness. On October 19th, the Donner Party's prayers were answered when Charles Stanton returned with provisions. Near the present-day site of Wadsworth, Nevada, Stanton brought news and desperately needed supplies from Sutter's Fort. His mules, loaded with flour and dried beef, were a lifeline for the starving immigrants. Captain Sutter's extraordinary generosity had made this possible, offering the supplies without any compensation or security. Stanton was joined by 2 Indian vaqueros, Luis and Salvador, who would serve as guides and caretakers for the animals. Their joy at Stanton's return was palpable, yet tragedy soon overshadowed this brief moment of relief. While preparing to move forward, William Foster and William Pike, 2 brave volunteers, set to scout ahead for more supplies. They suffered a devastating accident. As they cleaned a pistol near the campfire, the weapon unexpectedly discharged. Pike was struck fatally, leaving his wife a widow and his children fatherless. This heartbreaking accident cast a deep shadow over the party. Time was running out, and by late October, the Sierra Nevada loomed ahead. The party hesitated at Truckee Meadows, near modern-day Reno, to rest their exhausted cattle. But every day brought winter closer. On October 23rd, they finally pushed forward, only to encounter their worst fears. Snow fell earlier than expected, blanketing the ground in icy layers. At Prosser Creek, 3 miles below Truckee, they were met with 6 inches of snow. By October 28th, the drifts on the summits reached 5 feet deep, trapping the party in an icy wilderness. Attempts to cross the mountains were chaotic and futile. Some wagons were abandoned and their contents were lost. Groups splintered off, each family or faction acting independently. But none could breach the Sierra's icy stronghold, and their oxen, unaccustomed to carrying packs, bucked and bellowed as the pioneers tried to push through treacherous terrain. Stanton and the 2 native guides, Salvador and Lewis, fought valiantly to lead the group forward, but the mountains proved impenetrable. On a fateful night in November, as the pioneers prepared to make one last desperate push, the skies unleashed a relentless snowstorm. Mrs. Reed, her children wrapped in shawls, sat through the night, brushing snow off her family to keep them from being buried alive. The storm left the Donner Party completely isolated, sealing their fate. From this point forward, every choice they made would be a fight for survival in the face of unimaginable odds. With no escape from the snowbound mountains, the Donner Party braced for a brutal winter. Their first priority was shelter. Scattered across the area, they improvised homes from the sparse resources available. One cabin, already standing, offered a glimmer of hope. Built 2 years earlier by pioneers Moses Schellenberger, Joseph Foster, and Alan Montgomery, it was a rough structure of pine saplings and raw hides, measuring just 12 by 14 feet. It became a lifeline for some families. Yet, for the growing group of stranded migrants, one cabin was far from enough. The Breens moved into the cabin, but others had to fend for themselves. Kessberg's family constructed a half-shed against the cabin's west wall, a space that barely kept out the relentless cold. The Murphy family, further up the lake, built their shelter against a massive stone that served as a natural wall, using pine boughs and scraps of fabric for insulation. Meanwhile, the Graves and the Reed families settled in a double cabin downstream, hastily assembled with whatever materials they could find. The Donner families, trapped 6 miles away in Adler Creek Valley, fared the worst. With no time to build proper shelter, they pitched tents and draped brush for makeshift covers. Exposed to the elements, they faced the full fury of the Sierra winter. Each shelter was a patchwork of hopeless desperation, and none were sufficient for the months ahead. The cabins were overcrowded, poorly insulated, and offered little relief from the freezing temperatures. For those in tents, survival seemed nearly impossible. Snow piled high, sealing their makeshift dwellings and trapping the pioneers in their own meager refuges. Provisions ran dangerously low. Meat from the remaining cattle became the emigrants' only food source, and even that was limited. Digging through snowdrifts for frozen carcasses became a daily task, but the livestock's emaciated condition meant the meat provided little nourishment. An attempt to fish Donner Lake ended in failure. Though trout swam in its icy waters, they refused to take the bait. As the lake froze over, this slim hope vanished beneath thick ice. The Breen cabin held a grim history. In 1844, 17-year-old Moses Schallenberger had been left to guard supplies over the winter. Alone in the mountains, he survived on foxes caught in steel traps. His story was one of incredible endurance, but even Schallenberger himself admitted that it was sheer luck that saved him when a rescue party returned months later. For the Donner Party, facing a harsher winter and greater numbers, no such luck seemed likely. Inside their makeshift homes, the immigrants grew increasingly despondent. They subsisted on meager scraps of meat without so much as salt to improve its taste. Families huddled together for warmth, their breath visible in the freezing air. And tensions ran high as cramped spaces and dire circumstances frayed tempers. For those at Alder Creek, conditions were especially grim. Exposed to the storms with only tents and brush for shelter, every passing day brought them closer to death. By mid-November, the mountains were fully cloaked in snow. It lay in drifts of 10 to 15 feet, cutting off any chance of escape. The pioneers, dazed by their calamity, could only wait for what came next. The shelters were weak, the provisions were scarce, and the storm season had only begun. They were prisoners of the Sierra, locked in a battle for survival that few could have imagined. Even fewer would endure. The story of the Donner Party is far from over, and what began as a hopeful trek westward has descended into chaos and desperation. As the party prepares to face merciless Sierra Nevada winter, Their greatest trials are yet to come. Join us in part 2, where the true depths of their struggle will be revealed. The storms, the sacrifices, and the choices that would define their legacy forever.